The hum of the servers was the only constant companion in my life, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very floor of the radio observatory. Here, nestled in a forgotten wing, far from the colossal dishes that pierced the sky, I found my sanctuary. The vastness of the digital archive, the quiet dominion of forgotten tongues, was my world. My name is Reid Chen, and for years, I have walked the desolate plains of dead languages, a solitary cartographer of vanished thoughts. My expertise lay in the brittle whispers of antiquity, the cursive ghosts of civilizations that crumbled to dust millennia ago. I sought the patterns, the hidden structures, the very architecture of human expression, even when that expression seemed to claw its way from the abyss. My current obsession was a newly digitized collection of obscure 17th-century occult manuscripts, donated by a reclusive collector who insisted on anonymity. They were a chaotic jumble of alchemical symbols, astrological charts, and dense, arcane prose in Latin, Greek, and several Proto-Germanic dialects I barely recognized. Most scholars would have dismissed them as deluded ramblings, the fevered dreams of hermetic cults, but I saw the intricate weave, the desperate attempt to codify something profound, however misguided. Days blurred into weeks, nights into dawns, marked only by the shifting light through the reinforced window overlooking a distant, silent field. My desk, a landscape of monitors and half-empty mugs, became the epicenter of my existence. I lived on coffee and the thrill of decipherment, chasing lexical phantoms through endless scrolls of high-resolution scans. My fingers danced across the keyboard, mapping syntactical anomalies, cross-referencing glyphs, building a vast, internal lexicon of the forgotten. Then, it appeared. I was deep within a particularly convoluted text, a treatise on the celestial mechanics and the summoning of the deep earth, when a sequence of glyphs caught my eye. They were unlike anything I had catalogued thus far, not Latin, not Greek, certainly not any known Germanic script. They possessed a sharp, angular beauty, a geometry that felt both alien and strangely familiar, like a half-remembered dream of perfect order. I zoomed in, my breath catching in my throat. The script was embedded within a series of marginalia, a commentary on the main text, but it seemed to possess its own distinct logic, a syntax entirely unto itself. I isolated the passage, pulling it into a separate analysis window. It was short, perhaps 20 characters, arranged in a tight, almost suffocating cluster. My initial thought was a rare cipher, a new discovery. My heart quickened with the familiar thrum of intellectual pursuit. I began my usual process, frequency analysis, structural comparison, searching for any parallels in my extensive databases of esoteric languages. Nothing. The script defied categorization. It was an orphan, born outside the known lineages of human communication. This, in itself, was extraordinary. Most new scripts are eventually traced back to some protoform or a known family. This one felt unmoored. I spent the next few hours in a feverish state, trying every linguistic key I possessed. The more I studied it, the more I felt a subtle shift, not in the script itself, but in my own perception. The lines of the glyphs seemed to pulse with an internal light, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor that made my eyes ache. I blinked, rubbed them, convinced it was strain from the screen. Then, the impossible occurred. I had left the isolated passage on my secondary monitor, a static image, while I continued to scour the broader manuscript for similar occurrences. When I glanced back, a new symbol had emerged. It wasn't a trick of the light, not a pixel artifact. A small, hook-like appendage, previously absent, had subtly unfurled from the base of one of the angular characters. It was minuscule, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. My fingers froze midair above the keyboard. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass of the screen. Had I misremembered? Was I so deep in the rabbit hole of these obscure texts that my mind was playing tricks? I was meticulous, painstakingly so. Every new glyph, every variant, was logged and cross-referenced. I had stared at that exact sequence for hours. That hook was not there before. I took a screenshot, timestamped it, and then, with a tremor of unease, clicked back to the original manuscript page. I scrolled through the digital parchment, my gaze sweeping across the marginalia where I'd found the anomaly. I found the exact spot. The glyph was there, static, unmoving, precisely as I remembered it from my initial discovery. No hook. I returned to my isolated window. The hook remained. I refreshed the page, cleared the cache, even rebooted the analysis software. The hook persisted. My hands, usually so steady, now trembled as I typed a query into the system's metadata log. Was there a version control issue? Had the source file been updated? The system reported no changes to the original manuscript file for the last 6 months. My isolated analysis window, however, was clearly displaying a different version of the script. Not a different image, but the same image, subtly altered. It was as if the glyph had decided, on its own, to elaborate itself. I stared at the screen, the faint, internal pulse of the script seeming to intensify, echoing the sudden, rapid beat of my own heart. This wasn't a linguistic puzzle anymore. This was an entity, a self-generating linguistic structure, blossoming on my screen, evolving before my very eyes. A language that changed itself. A language that lived. The thought, both exhilarating and terrifying, sent a shiver down my spine, a premonition of something ancient stirring, something that had been waiting, dormant, within the digital ether. And I, Reid Chen, had just found its key. The hum of the servers, a low, constant beast, was the true heartbeat of my world. It resonated through the floorboards of the radio observatory, a deep, pervasive thrum that sometimes felt like it was vibrating not just the building, but the very bones within me. Here, in my sanctuary, a forgotten wing far from the colossal dishes that spun like silent prayers to the cosmos, the digital archive unfolded. I had found my quarry, or perhaps, it had found me. The screen glowed with the raw, untouched images of the 17th century manuscripts. Parchment yellowed like ancient teeth, ink faded to ghost whispers, but the script itself. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Not Latin, not Greek, not even the obscure runic fragments I had spent decades coaxing meaning from. This was something else entirely. Jagged lines intertwined with fluid curves, forming characters that seemed to shift, subtly, in the periphery of my vision, as if they breathed. They were less symbols and more echoes of forgotten forms, a dance of shadow and light caught in the brittle embrace of time. My fingers, usually dancing across ancient texts, now hesitated, a tremor of pure intellectual hunger seizing them. The initial scan had flagged it as an unknown, an anomaly, a linguistic orphan. But as I began the painstaking process of transcription, character by character, the true strangeness revealed itself. It possessed no discernible root words, no consistent grammatical structure that mapped to any known linguistic family. Each character, while appearing unique, seemed to contain echoes of others, fractal repetitions that defied a simple one-to-one translation. It was a language of internal reference, a self-devouring serpent of meaning. When I isolated a sequence, hoping to find a pattern, the surrounding characters would subtly rearrange themselves, as if the very act of observation altered their relationship. "Impossible," I murmured, the word a dry whisper in the vast, humming quiet. My determination, usually a quiet current, now surged, a torrent. I spent hours, then days, lost in the luminous grid of the screen. The outside world, a distant concept of sunrises and sunsets, ceased to exist. There was only the script, its intricate, impossible logic unfolding before me. I developed a provisional lexicon, a fragile scaffolding built on intuition rather than rule. A recurring cluster of glyphs, which I tentatively labeled formseeker, seemed to appear whenever the surrounding text described an act of creation or manifestation. Yet, their meaning was never static. The formseeker might, in a different context, imply dissolution, its lines twisting to suggest a collapse rather than a genesis. It was a language that mutated, not just between texts, but within the very lines I was studying. The first subtle distortion came with the onset of the third night. My eyes, gritty from strain, were fixed on a particularly dense paragraph. The characters, usually rendered in a stark, digital black, seemed to deepen in hue, a richer, more profound absence of light. Then, the hum of the servers, a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat, began to subtly warp. It wasn't louder or softer, but its texture changed. It felt granulated, as if the air itself was vibrating with countless tiny, sharp particles. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. But the phantom lingered. They weren't just absences of light, they were presences, fluid and vast. I forced myself to breathe, to blink. The server hum returned to its familiar, soothing drone. "Reid," I muttered, my voice hoarse, "you're overthinking it." The script, even then, was not merely a collection of dead symbols. My intellectual curiosity, a powerful drug, pushed me onward. I had to understand this. I had to break its code, no matter the cost. The challenge was too profound, too utterly captivating, to abandon. I returned to the screen, the breathing script waiting, its impossible logic beckoning me deeper into its evolving labyrinth. The air in the radio observatory was a constant, low thrum, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate not just in the floorboards but in the very marrow of my bones. Hours blurred into an unbroken continuum of screen glow and whispered hypothesis. The digitized manuscripts, now hundreds strong, flickered before me, an endless parade of impossible glyphs and serpentine ligatures. My eyes burned, but a different kind of fire had ignited behind them, a furious, exhilarating blaze. I had come here seeking a quiet solitude, the kind of vast, almost desolate peace that only a place dedicated to listening to the emptiness of space could offer. Instead, I found a new kind of silence, one that the language itself seemed to carve out around me, pressing close. For days, I had been tracing the lines, charting the recurrences, mapping the strange, recursive grammar that defied every known linguistic principle. It wasn't just a code, it was a living algorithm, a self-generating fractal of meaning. Then, late one night, as the distant dishes of the radio observatory rotated with a barely audible groan against the star-dusted velvet of the sky, it happened. A particular sequence, a cluster of 5 symbols I had dismissed as an idiosyncratic flourish, suddenly shimmered into clarity. It wasn't just a noun-verb construct, as I had initially theorized. It was a reflexive modifier, a symbol that didn't just change the meaning of what it touched, but reflected it, inverted it, and then reintegrated it, creating a new, impossibly layered concept. A gasp tore from my throat, raw and sudden in the hushed chamber. My chair scraped back, a jarring sound. I stood, trembling, staring at the screen. It was a mirror, I realized, a linguistic mirror. The script wasn't just describing reality, it was reflecting it in a way that revealed hidden dimensions, unseen connections. It was a language designed to show the underside of things, the skeletal structure beneath the flesh of the mundane. I had cracked it. A fundamental aspect. And in doing so, I had opened a door. I looked away from the screen, my gaze sweeping across the control room. The familiar panels of blinking lights, the banks of monitors displaying abstract data streams, the tangle of cables on the floor, they were no longer just functional objects. The light from a small, red indicator lamp on a distant console pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to echo the newly understood reflexive modifier. The cables, previously a haphazard mess, now appeared to weave an intricate, deliberate pattern, a three-dimensional manifestation of the script's syntax. Impossible, I breathed, my voice hoarse. I walked to the panoramic window, pressing my hand against the cool glass. They were forms, shifting and coalescing, not quite solid, not quite smoke, but something in between. They writhed, mirroring the serpentine curves of the manuscript's glyphs, their silent rotation no longer a mechanical function but a slow, deliberate articulation of the language itself. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Was I seeing this, truly seeing it, or was my mind, stretched taut by days of relentless study, finally snapping? The very air seemed to thicken, imbued with a new, subtle weight. The low hum of the observatory, once a background drone, now carried a distinct, almost melodic undertone, a resonant vibration that seemed to carry meaning. Not words, but pure, unfiltered conceptual data, flowing directly into my awareness. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my lids. This wasn't a hallucination born of exhaustion, it was a revelation, terrifying in its clarity. The language wasn't just a system of symbols, it was a lens, and through it, the world was revealing its hidden, monstrous grammar. I had sought to understand the script, to translate its dead meaning. But the script, it seemed, had begun to translate me, to rewrite my perception, to integrate me into its impossible reality. And I, mesmerized and horrified, knew I could not look away. Hours had congealed into a single, seamless block of frantic deciphering, the anomalous script writhing across my monitor like a colony of intelligent, hungry insects. Each character, each ligature, seemed to pull at the very fabric of my understanding, not just of language, but of the world it described. I stumbled out of the observatory just as the first bruised light of dawn smeared the horizon. The world outside felt thinner. The air, usually crisp with the promise of morning, tasted like dust and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of an old wound. The drive home was a blur of muted colors and softened edges, the familiar route suddenly alien, as if the road itself had subtly shifted its course. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's, hollow-eyed and etched with a weariness that went beyond mere physical strain. Stepping into my apartment, the air was still and cold, a stark contrast to the observatory's perpetual thrum. I shed my coat, letting it fall to the floor, a small act of rebellion against the meticulous order I usually maintained. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf, a familiar comfort, row upon row of bound knowledge. But something was wrong. The spine of my first edition of The Golden Bough, a book I cherished, was not where it should be. It sat 2 shelves down, nestled between volumes of obscure folklore, a place it had never occupied. A flicker of annoyance, then a shrug. Exhaustion, I told myself. A lapse in memory. I must have moved it last week and simply forgotten. I made my way to the kitchen, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, a sound that seemed deeper, more resonant than usual. The kettle, a sturdy cast-iron relic, sat on the stove. I filled it, the water sloshing with an unnatural echo. As it heated, I leaned against the counter, rubbing the grit from my eyes. When I looked up, the small ceramic salt shaker, usually placed precisely in the center of the wooden cutting board, was now at the very edge, threatening to topple. My hand reached out instinctively, steadying it. A tremor ran through me. It was too precise a shift for a casual bump. The cat, perhaps? But I didn't own a cat. The kettle shrieked, a sound that tore through the quiet, making me jump. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. I poured the steaming water into a mug, the rising vapor momentarily obscuring my vision. Through the swirling mist, the pattern on my kitchen tiles, a simple geometric design, seemed to writhe, the lines subtly twisting, stretching, then snapping back into place. My vision had always been sharp, but the past few days had blurred the edges of my perception. I carried my tea into the living room, sinking onto the worn armchair. When I turned to face them directly, they dissolved, becoming mere patches of gloom once more. My breath hitched. This was more than fatigue. This was the edge of something I didn't want to name. My gaze fell upon the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a gift from my grandmother. Its pendulum swung with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. But as I watched, the polished brass seemed to ripple, the surface of the metal shifting like disturbed water. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The clock was normal, solid, silent in its dignified age. This wasn't just exhaustion or stress. My mind, a fortress of logic and order, felt like it was crumbling. The world, my world, was fraying at the edges, revealing glimpses of something monstrous beneath the veneer of the mundane. I stood up, slowly, my muscles stiff, and walked to the window. The street below was deserted, the familiar lampposts standing sentinel. A profound, terrifying certainty began to bloom in my chest. The language wasn't just describing a different reality, it was unmaking mine. And I was the lens through which it was happening. My eyes burned, but the exhaustion was a distant concept, a memory of a time before this all-consuming pursuit. A subtle shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt, rippled across the edge of a monitor. I blinked, rubbing the bridge of my nose, dismissing it as fatigue. But then the air itself seemed to waver, just for a breath, above the keyboard. The shimmering vanished, leaving only the dull sheen of the plastic keys. I tried to focus on the next sequence of symbols, the ones I'd been calling the recursive connectors, but my concentration fractured. A grid, not of lines, but of impossibly sharp angles and curves that didn't quite adhere to Euclidean geometry. They pulsed, silent and swift, like the fleeting afterimage of a starburst, gone before I could fix them in my direct gaze. My chair, the console's metal frame, even the smooth glass of the window looking out into the pre-dawn dark, they all seemed to momentarily host these phantom blueprints. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This was different. More precise. More real. The hallucination of a tired brain usually felt like a degradation, a blurring. This was an addition, a sharpening of reality, revealing strata I hadn't known existed. The script on my screen seemed to vibrate with a new intensity, each character now a miniature vortex, drawing my gaze deeper. I traced a particularly complex glyph with my finger on the display, a symbol that had recurred with unnerving frequency, and as I did, the intricate pattern on the wall beside me, a seemingly random scuff mark, momentarily resolved into a perfect, non-repeating fractal. It was there, then gone, leaving only the ordinary imperfection. A cold dread seeped into my bones, a different kind of fear than the intellectual terror I'd known before. This wasn't just a language I was translating. This was a lens. The script wasn't merely describing a hidden reality, it was revealing it, peeling back the mundane veneer of the world. It was a key, each deciphered fragment turning at tumblers and a lock I hadn't known was there. I pushed back from the console, the chair scraping loudly on the concrete floor, a jarring sound in the profound quiet. I stood, my legs stiff, and walked to the vast observation window. Beyond the glass, the faint blush of false dawn was beginning to paint the horizon, outlining the distant peaks. But as I stared, the peaks themselves began to ripple. Not like water, but like a sheet of paper being folded by an invisible hand. Edges shifted, angles changed, and for a terrifying instant, a triangular mountain peak became a perfect, impossible hexahedron, its facets glinting with a light that wasn't the sun's. Then, with a shudder, it snapped back to its familiar, geological form. The world wasn't just reacting to the script, it was composed of it. The script wasn't a language about reality, but a language of reality. A meta-language, an underlying code governing existence itself. The horror wasn't just that I was seeing things, it was that the things I was seeing were always there, waiting for the right sequence of symbols to make them manifest. A low thrum vibrated through the floor beneath my feet, deeper than the observatory's usual operating hum. It felt less like a machine, more like a colossal string being plucked, resonating through bone and sinew. My eyes swept the room, now truly alert, truly terrified. Every surface threatened to peel back and reveal the impossible geometry beneath. The air itself felt denser, charged with unseen patterns. And the world was beginning to show me what lay beyond. My own reflection in the dark glass of a dormant screen showed eyes too wide, pupils dilated past reason, a stranger's face etched with a manic intensity. A cold dread, sharp as splintered bone, finally pierced the feverish haze of my work. This wasn't just late-night exhaustion. This was a precipice. The world outside, the one I knew, was slipping away like sand through an open palm, replaced by a monstrous filigree woven into the ordinary. I needed an anchor, a voice from the world before. My thoughts turned to a former mentor, a scholar of forgotten tongues whose quiet wisdom had once seemed boundless. Dr. Eris Thorne. He had a way of seeing patterns where others saw chaos, of understanding the architecture of knowledge. He would understand the academic side of this, at least, before the more unsettling implications presented themselves. Or so I hoped. My fingers, trembling slightly, fumbled for my phone. The screen glowed, a miniature beacon of sanity. Thorne. I pressed the call icon. The dial tone began, a steady, reassuring pulse. Then it wavered. A low, guttural thrum bled into the clean tone, a sound like a distant, massive engine groaning to life beneath the earth. I pulled the phone from my ear, staring at it as if it had betrayed me. The screen flickered, briefly displaying a cascade of symbols identical to those I was translating, before returning to the ongoing call. I brought it back to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was thin, reedy, barely my own. Only static answered, but it wasn't ordinary static. They weren't just noise, they felt like meaning struggling to emerge, a language without form. Suddenly, the call disconnected. No call ended message, no red icon. Just blackness. I tried again, my thumb pressing the redial with desperate urgency. The screen remained stubbornly blank. I jabbed the power button, then the home button, but the device was utterly unresponsive. A cold stone settled in my gut. This wasn't a dead battery, the phone had been fully charged just hours ago. This was an excision. I threw the inert device onto a nearby console, its thud swallowed by the observatory's pervasive hum. My gaze swept across the room, seeking another avenue, another lifeline. My laptop, connected to the observatory's network, sat open on a work table. Email. A less direct route, perhaps, but less prone to the caprices of a failing mobile network. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing out Dr. Thorne's email address. Then, the subject line, urgent query regarding unprecedented linguistic anomaly. I hesitated, the words feeling utterly inadequate, almost comical against the backdrop of my unraveling sanity. How could I articulate this? How could I explain the way the world was subtly, horribly shifting? Dr. Thorne, I typed, I've encountered a linguistic structure unlike anything documented. It's self-generating. It seems to be affecting my perception. The manuscripts I'm studying, they're not merely texts. They're blueprints. I'm seeing things, hearing things. The very air is different. As I wrote seeing things, hearing things, the cursor began to pulse, not with its usual steady rhythm, but with an erratic, almost organic beat. The letters I had just typed shimmered, their edges blurring, elongating into tendrils that seemed to writhe across the screen. They curled, not into new letters, but into the same impossible symbols from the manuscripts, a brief, horrifying morphing that lasted only a second before the text snapped back to normal. But when I looked again, the word blueprints had subtly changed. One of the P's had a tiny, almost imperceptible extra stroke, turning it into something else, something subtly alien. And the word air was now subtly italicized, though I hadn't done it. The language was reaching out, not just into my perception, but into the very tools I used to communicate, subtly rewriting my attempts to cry for help. I forced myself to continue, deleting the altered P, correcting the italics, trying to ignore the subtle, almost taunting shifts. I need your guidance, I typed, the words tasting like ash. This is beyond my understanding. I fear I've activated something. I clicked send. The progress bar appeared, a thin green line crawling across the bottom of the screen. It reached halfway, then stopped. Not frozen, but simply stopped, as if the network itself had decided to hold its breath. The line then began to recede, slowly, deliberately, until it vanished. The email remained in my outbox, unsent, trapped in a digital limbo. The hum of the machinery no longer felt comforting. It was a mocking chorus, a deep, resonant laughter from something unseen. I was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone with this burgeoning, unspoken horror. The world outside had become a distant shore, and I, adrift in a sea of glyphs, was being pulled under. The green bar, once a promise of connection, had receded into the void of the screen, leaving behind only the stark blackness of a failed transmission. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a phantom chill tracing their tips. I tried again, selecting the massive file of annotated script fragments, the raw data, the emerging grammar. The progress bar appeared, crawled for a fraction of a second, then dissolved, faster this time, like smoke. This wasn't a glitch. This was an active blockage. Abandoning the futile attempt, I turned back to the primary display, where the digitized occult manuscripts glowed with an unsettling luminescence. My eyes, weary from endless hours of scrutiny, swept over the familiar characters, the serpentine lines, the sharp angles. I had cataloged them, cross-referenced them, built a nascent lexicon in my mind. Yet, a flicker of unease caught me. Different. A subtle shift in its internal geometry, a new, almost imperceptible barb extending from its curve. I zoomed in, my breath catching. The symbol had changed. What was once a closed loop now possessed a delicate, tendril-like extension, reaching out as if grasping. I scrolled through the pages, my heart thrumming an erratic rhythm against my ribs. More of them. Not all, but a significant number of the complex glyphs I'd spent weeks dissecting now bore these minute, organic alterations. They were evolving, right there on the digital page, without my input, without any logical explanation. A soft hum emanated from the server rack in the corner, a sound I usually ignored, but now it felt charged with a strange resonance. The screen flickered, not a dying gasp, but a vibrant, almost energetic ripple that passed through the image. Then, from the margins of the manuscript, a single, new character began to form. It wasn't part of the original scan. It bloomed from the digital ether, a complex arrangement of familiar elements twisted into a wholly novel shape, pulsating faintly with an inner light. It was as if the text itself was breathing, generating new forms directly onto my monitor. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling. I needed to document this, to capture the undeniable evidence of the script's autonomy. As I unlocked the screen, a text message notification appeared. It was from an unknown sender, just a single, cryptic symbol. It was one of the newly formed characters from the manuscript margins, rendered in stark black pixels. My hand trembled, nearly dropping the device. How? How could a symbol from a centuries-old, self-generating script appear as a text on my personal phone? The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My gaze drifted from the screen, past the stacks of forgotten books, to the window. The pre-dawn light was still a bruised purple, but something else caught my attention. On the frosted pane, a pattern had begun to emerge from the condensation, a delicate tracery that mirrored the evolving script. Not exact, not yet, but the underlying geometry, the serpentine flow, the sharp, grasping angles, they were undeniably there. The digital was bleeding into the physical. If the script could manifest on my phone, on my window, what boundaries did it respect? I felt a sudden, desperate urge to verify something, anything, beyond the confines of my increasingly warped reality. My mind, a whirlwind of fear and a strange, morbid curiosity, fixated on one place, the radio observatory. The towering dishes, skeletal against the burgeoning sky, rose like ancient sentinels from the rolling hills. The air here was sharp, clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. I walked beneath the colossal structures, their surfaces, designed for cosmic reception, now seemed to my fractured perception to be etched with faint, unsettling patterns. Was it just the condensation, the dust, the play of light? A maintenance technician, a young man with tired eyes, emerged from one of the smaller control buildings. He nodded, his expression neutral. "You're back early, Reid Chen. Couldn't sleep?" "Something like that," I managed, my voice raspy. "Is there any unusual activity? Any interference?" He frowned, looking up at the nearest dish, its massive bowl tilted towards the heavens. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir. Just the usual background noise from the universe." "Why? You seeing ghosts in the data again?" He gave a weak chuckle, clearly oblivious to the very real ghosts that were beginning to manifest around me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The background noise he spoke of, the static hum of existence, suddenly felt profoundly different to me. It wasn't just random cosmic chatter, it was a rhythmic pulse, a growing murmur that was beginning to coalesce into a language I was unwittingly learning to speak. I was no longer merely translating a dead language, I was becoming a conduit for a living one, and it was beginning to rewrite the world around me, character by terrifying character. The hum of the server racks was a low, constant drone, a mechanical heartbeat against the vast, silent canvas of space. I stood before the main console, the glow of its multiple screens painting my face in shifting hues of green and blue. The technician, a young man with a perpetually bewildered expression, had returned to his own station after his weak chuckle, seemingly content to monitor the static whispers of the cosmos. He saw background noise, I, however, felt the tendrils of a waking nightmare. My fingers, cold despite the room's temperature, hovered over the keyboard. The data stream, a torrent of digitized signals from the largest dish outside, scrolled before me. And within it, I saw them, not with my eyes, not truly, but with a deeper, more nascent faculty. The patterns of the anomalous language, the very glyphs I had unearthed, seemed to shimmer in the static, not on the screen, but through it. A tremor started in my hands, a phantom vibration. The sterile lines of the observatory's interior began to waver, softening at the edges like a watercolor left in the rain. The metal beams of the ceiling stretched, then warped, their angles becoming impossibly acute, then impossibly obtuse. The air itself grew thick, heavy with an unspoken weight, and the hum of the servers faded, replaced by a resonant, inaudible thrum that vibrated deep within my bones. Then, the world shattered. I was no longer in the radio observatory. The fluorescent lights, the blinking consoles, the oblivious technician, all gone. Instead, I stood on a precipice of something vast and terrible. Below me, a landscape unfolded, not of earth or stone, but of convoluted, crystalline structures that defied the very notion of up or down. Jagged spires of obsidian-like material pierced a sky that was not blue or black, but a swirling maelstrom of bruised purples and sickly greens, laced with threads of impossible, incandescent light. The ground beneath my feet, if it could be called ground, was a tessellation of facets, each reflecting a different, distorted angle of the alien vista. There were no horizons, no clear boundaries. Perspective itself seemed a fluid, mocking concept. Structures, like colossal, petrified fungi, rose from the depths, their forms hinting at a geometry that could only exist by tearing holes in reality. They were intricate, yet utterly devoid of purpose, monuments to an indifference so profound it was more terrifying than malice. And then I saw them. Not individuals, not beings with definable shapes or intent, but vast, sprawling presences. They were not on the landscape, but of it, or perhaps the landscape was merely a manifestation of their slumbering forms. They were not looking at me, they were not aware of me. I was less than an atom, an irrelevant flicker in their eternal, unknowable existence. My human mind, accustomed to scale, to order, to the comforting confines of a comprehensible universe, buckled under the weight of it. These were not gods, they were the raw, unthinking processes of a universe too vast, too ancient, too uncaring to even notice the brief, frantic blip of my species. They simply were, and their being dwarfed all human striving, all hope, all meaning. I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and the vision flickered. The impossible colors bled away, replaced by the familiar, if still wavering, glow of the console screens. "You all right?" The technician's voice, startlingly close, pulled me back further. He was standing beside me, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand, his brow furrowed with mild concern. "Just..." A static burst, I managed, my voice a dry rasp. My hands gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white. He shrugged, oblivious. "Universe is noisy. Lotta junk out there." Junk. He called it junk. It was showing them to me. It was a key, not to translation, but to perception. And it was forcing me to perceive. The hum of the radio observatory was a low, resonant thrum against the vast silence of the desert night. I had driven for hours, past the last flickering lights of civilization, seeking a place where the air felt thin and the stars were an indifferent, unblinking ocean. The colossal dishes, like white, upturned palms, reached for the heavens, their metallic skin glinting under the moon. Here, I thought, away from the city's clamor, away from the familiar patterns of brick and glass, perhaps the new perceptions would clarify, or at least, recede, but they didn't. They intensified. I sat at a console in a dimly lit control room, the glow of screens painting my face in shifting hues. My laptop sat open, displaying the latest iteration of the script, a swirling vortex of impossible angles and lines that refused to resolve into any known alphabet. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I needed to understand. But the terror that had seized me in my study, the chilling realization that the language wasn't merely describing but showing, still clung to me like a shroud. I had seen the world through its lens, and the world was wrong. The air shimmered with unseen currents, the concrete walls pulsed with a hidden, organic life. The very dust motes danced with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. It's just... I focused on a particularly dense passage, a sequence of glyphs. That had been resisting my efforts for weeks. As I stared, the lines began to shift, to writhe. They were no longer static symbols on a screen. They were apertures. Through them, I saw. Not images, not memories, but pure sensation. A taste, metallic and ancient, like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, but infinitely more profound. It was the sound of things that were not meant to be heard. My hands trembled. I gripped the edge of the console, the cold metal a stark anchor in the swirling chaos of my senses. The script was a key, yes, but not one I was turning. It was turning me. This wasn't translation in the academic sense. This was assimilation. My eyes, usually a calm hazel, seemed to hold a new depth, a subtle, unsettling glint. Was it just the low light? The lines were there, faint but unmistakable, like microscopic etchings on the delicate membrane of my vision. A wave of nausea washed over me. I wasn't just observing the language anymore. I was becoming part of its lexicon. My dreams had been changing too, morphing from familiar landscapes into impossible geometries, where gravity was a suggestion and light bent into non-Euclidean angles. A sudden itch bloomed on my forearm. I scratched at it, then looked down. Where my skin had been smooth, a raised, delicate tracery had appeared, a faint, silvery network of lines that resembled, with horrifying precision, a fragment of the script. It wasn't a rash. It was a pattern. It was growing. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I was not translating the language. The language was translating me. It was inscribing itself onto my very being, rewriting my perception, my thoughts, my dreams, even the physical topography of my skin. I was no longer an observer, I was the canvas. I was the medium. This wasn't an intellectual puzzle. This was an invasion. I had offered myself as its living, breathing vessel. The things I saw, the sounds I heard, the patterns forming on my flesh, they were not external horrors. They were me. And the transformation had only just begun. I was becoming the translated, and the original text was something monstrous, something ancient, something utterly alien. Instead, the cosmic indifference mirrored the language's own cold, absolute logic. I turned the car homeward, a magnetic pull drawing me back to the crucible of my own undoing. When I finally parked outside my building, the brick facade appeared to ripple, its mortar lines breathing a faint, phosphorescent glow visible only to me. The lock mechanism groaned, a sound like grinding bone, as I turned it. Stepping into the apartment was like entering a familiar dream that had curdled. The air was thick, not with dust, but with a palpable presence, an almost audible thrum that vibrated in my teeth. My coat, slung over the chair, seemed to twitch at the edges, its fabric weaving and unweaving itself into fleeting, meaningless patterns. I moved into the living room, my steps unnaturally heavy on the rug. The pattern, a simple geometric design, now writhed. My collection of rare books, usually a source of quiet joy, stood sentinel on their shelves, but their spines no longer aligned. Each volume seemed to lean at a slightly different, impossible angle, creating a jagged horizon of warped knowledge. The boundaries were blurring. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the wall beside my desk. The plaster felt slick, then rough, then unexpectedly yielding, like aged leather. The texture changed beneath my touch, a silent conversation in an unknown tactile language. I withdrew my hand as if burned, though no heat was present. The desk itself, once a bastion of intellectual order, was now the epicenter of the convergence. My translation notes, scattered across the surface, were no longer static ink on paper. The symbols pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored the thrumming in my ears. Then, the shift truly began. The far wall, where a framed map of ancient trade routes usually hung, began to ripple. It wasn't a trick of light or tired eyes. Not solid objects, but ideas of architecture. Angles that defied Euclidean geometry, planes that intersected without touching, curves that bent back on themselves into infinite recursion. It was the sound of existence being unstitched, rewoven according to an alien loom. I saw them then, not as creatures, but as the principles behind the shifting architecture. They were the logic, the grammar, the syntax made manifest. The architects were not beings with eyes or limbs, but the intent woven into the impossible spaces, the silent, terrible understanding that underpinned the collapsing reality. This was it. This was the source. The language wasn't a description of reality, it was a blueprint. And I, by deciphering it, had given it purchase, had allowed it to rewrite the very rules of my perception, of my home, of existence itself. The bookshelf to my left elongated, stretching into a dizzying tunnel of endless volumes, each spine a grinning maw. The ceiling above me receded into an infinite expanse of shifting, interlocking patterns, like the inside of a vast, incomprehensible machine. I stood amidst the convergence, my determination now a terrifying conduit. The lines between my own fracturing mind and the external world had vanished. The impossible space was not around me, it was within me. I was not merely observing the architect's work, I was experiencing it from the inside out, my consciousness becoming one with the raw, unadulterated process of its manifestation. And in that terrifying union, I understood. The language wasn't just ancient, it was primordial. It wasn't just malevolent, it was indifferent, a fundamental force awaiting activation. And I had activated it. Here, beneath the wheeling dust of stars, I had hoped for clarity, or perhaps, for a definitive end to the whispers. Each thrum of the machinery seemed to translate into a syllable within my skull, a word without sound, a meaning without form. My fingers, once so adept at tracing the elegant curves of forgotten scripts, now felt alien, heavy. They twitched, yearning for a pen, for a surface, for the terrible act of inscription that had brought me to this precipice. A faint tremor began in my left hand, a vibration beneath the skin that wasn't quite a shiver. It was an internal hum, a sympathetic resonance with the language that had burrowed so deep. I watched it, detached, as if observing a stranger's affliction. I flexed my fingers, and the sensation intensified, a subtle, burning calligraphy unfolding beneath the surface. This was new. The mental erosion, the fractured perception, these had been my companions for weeks. But this physical intrusion, this visceral rewriting, felt like a final, irreversible chapter. I pressed my palm against the cool metal of the console, seeking an anchor, a solid truth. My own touch seemed foreign. The air in the control room, stale and smelling faintly of ozone and old dust, began to shift. It wasn't a draft, but a pressure, a thickening that pressed against my eardrums. The thrum of the observatory deepened, becoming a chord, then a drone, then a chorus of voiceless tones. When I opened them again, the room had subtly changed. The edges of the monitors shimmered, their dormant pixels coalescing into fleeting patterns that mirrored the impossible geometries I had seen in the language. It felt rough, porous, like weathered stone, not metal. My mind raced, or what was left of it. This was not hallucination. This was perception. The world was not changing, my eyes were changing, my mind was changing, learning to see the underlying architecture. The language wasn't just words, it was the blueprint of reality, and I was becoming its lens. A searing heat bloomed in my chest, spreading outward like ink through water. It wasn't pain, not precisely, but an intense, undeniable presence. It pushed against my ribs, expanded through my veins. My heart hammered, not with fear, but with an almost frantic energy, as if trying to keep pace with an accelerating current. I gasped. A sound thin and reedy in the resonant chamber. My skin felt tight, stretched over something new. I lifted my hand, turning it over, searching for a mirror to see the transformation I knew was occurring. But I didn't need a mirror. I could feel it. The fine hairs on my arms seemed to stiffen, to lengthen, catching the ambient light with an unnatural sheen. My fingernails, once neatly trimmed, felt thicker, harder, almost claw-like against my thumb. It spoke without vocal cords, without air, a pure thought form that was the language itself, finally articulate. It named things, not in human tongue, but in the fundamental resonance of their being. And then, it named me. But the name it spoke was not Reid. It was a complex, interlocking series of glyphs, a vibrational signature that obliterated my former identity. My memories, once anchors, now floated away like autumn leaves on a rising tide. My life, my studies, my very name, they were becoming irrelevant, overwritten by the surge of pure information. I was no longer observing the transformation, I was being the transformation. The burning in my chest intensified, coalescing into a single point of absolute clarity. I understood now. The manuscripts, the scripts, the self-generating patterns, they were not a message to be translated. They were an instruction set. A program. My body, my mind, my very self, was merely the temporary vessel, the staging ground for something vast and impersonal to manifest. My will, my determination, had been nothing more than the final, pathetic flicker of a candle about to be extinguished. The observatory's hum reached a crescendo, a single, sustained note that vibrated through every atom of my being. My vision blurred, then sharpened, perceiving not objects, but their underlying energetic matrices. My ears registered not sound, but the silent, cosmic symphony of existence. And in that moment, Reid Chen ceased to be. There was only the language, flowing through me, becoming me, a living script poised to rewrite the mundane world into its true, monstrous form. The vastness of the desert night outside, the blind dishes reaching, were no longer empty. They were waiting. And I, the new I, was ready. Above, the stars were not pinpricks of light but gaping wounds in the fabric of what I once called reality. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed. The language, the insidious syntax that had unraveled my world, was here, too, woven into the very air, vibrating through the earth. My determination, a stubborn ember in the hurricane of my dissolving self, had brought me to this precipice. The manuscripts, now a blur of incomprehensible glyphs, had laid the groundwork. This place, this monument to cosmic listening, would be the amplifier. I moved closer to one of the smaller dishes, its surface cool beneath my trembling fingers. It was a resonance, a feedback loop. The language was not merely a set of symbols, it was a vibrational frequency, a pattern of existence. My breath hitched. The stars above shifted, not in position, but in their very essence. They became points of meaning, nodes in an incomprehensible network. Each glimmer, each nebula, was a character, a phrase, contributing to a vast, silent sentence that spanned the cosmos. The blackness between them was not absence, but the binding grammar, the terrifying structure that held it all together. A dizzying rush of comprehension slammed into me, not as thoughts, but as pure, unadulterated knowing. The universe was not a collection of objects and forces, it was a single, self-generating linguistic construct. Galaxies were sprawling paragraphs, nebulae were intricate clauses, planets were punctuation marks, and life, my life, was but a fleeting, insignificant word in a sentence that had no beginning and no end. I stumbled, my knees buckling under the weight of this revelation. The ground beneath me was no longer solid earth but a woven mat of interwoven meanings, each atom a syllable, each stone a forgotten proverb. The wind that swept across the desert carried not sand, but a relentless, indifferent chant, the ceaseless articulation of existence. My own body began to distort in my perception. My hands, once familiar, seemed to ripple, their flesh not skin and bone but layers of complex, self-referential text. My veins were not conduits for blood, but for flowing streams of glyphs, each beat of my heart a rhythmic punctuation mark in a biological sentence. I was not Reid Chen, I was a living, breathing dictionary, a conduit through which the universe was writing itself. There was no malevolence in this system, no intent, no hatred. Only an infinite, indifferent logic. The language was not trying to destroy me, it was simply including me. My humanity, my individuality, my very sense of self, were ephemeral constructs, fragile illusions that had now been parsed, translated, and absorbed into the vast, eternal syntax. They were not instruments of discovery but monumental ear trumpets, designed to funnel the ceaseless, silent monologue of the universe into a form comprehensible to beings who believed in separate words and distinct meanings. But there were no separate words. There was only the language. My tongue felt heavy, clumsy. I tried to speak, to utter my name, to reclaim some fragment of my old identity. But the sounds that emerged were not English, nor any language I had ever studied. They were guttural, resonant clicks and whistles, sounds that echoed the wind, the grinding of tectonic plates, the distant hum of the observatory's machinery. They were the sounds of the universe, articulated through my dissolving throat. Reid Chen was gone. His fears, his hopes, his struggles, all had been footnotes to a much larger, unspeakable text. I was no longer seeing the universe through the language, I was the language, perceiving itself. The vastness was not out there, but within, an interconnected, horrifyingly indifferent system of meaning, and I was merely a fleeting, self-aware echo within its eternal, silent pronouncements. The night deepened, the stars burned with an alien intensity, and the hum of the radio observatory became the pulse of my new, terrifying existence. I was no longer a man, I was a sentence. And the universe had just begun its next paragraph. Months had spun themselves into a tapestry of dust and silence around the radio observatory, each thread a testament to the slow, inexorable alteration of the world. It was not the hum of the dishes, though their colossal ears still tilted skyward, gathering what they could from the void. No, this was an internal vibration, a frequency tuned to the new language that had, in its quiet, insidious way, begun to rewrite the very air I breathed. My skin felt like parchment, stretched taut over bones that remembered warmth but no longer retained it. I was an observer now, a witness to the unfolding of a grammar that sought to reform existence itself. My eyes, once clouded by the fog of sanity, now saw with a clarity that was its own form of madness. I watched the world through the observatory screens, through static-laced broadcasts, through the flickering windows of a dying network. The images were mundane, ordinary, yet for me, they vibrated with a terrifying subtext. A news anchor, her smile too wide, too fixed, spoke of unprecedented weather patterns. But I saw the clouds behind her, not as vapor and light, but as cursive strokes, fluid characters unfurling across the sky, writing a sentence the world was too blind to read. In a distant city, a crowd gathered for a festival. Their movements, a chaotic dance of individual wills, coalesced into something else entirely for me. A vast, intricate diagram, each person a node, each gesture a vector. They were not dancing, they were tracing an algorithm, a self-generating mandala that resonated with the scripts that had first whispered to me from the brittle pages. The joy on their faces, the music in the air, it was all a carefully orchestrated performance, a ritual of unaware activation. I listened to the radio, the static and incessant companion. A colleague, his voice strained, reported on strange migratory patterns of birds, flocks flying in formations never before documented, spiraling upwards until they vanished into the glare of the sun. But I heard the patterns in their cries, a complex syntax of fear and obedience, a chorus chanting a phoneme I had glimpsed in the deepest, most forbidden recesses of the ancient texts. The dishes of the radio observatory, once instruments of discovery, now felt like enormous, passive receptors, quietly absorbing the planet's evolving lexicon. The desert outside the observatory offered its own grim lessons. The saguaros, their arms reaching skyward, seemed to stretch further, their spines bristling with an unnatural vigor. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, I saw it in the reflection of a monitor screen. My own face, gaunt and etched with the knowledge I carried, but behind my eyes, something else. Not my own reflection, not the fading light of the desert, but a shimmering, multi-layered overlay. A faint, almost transparent script danced across my pupils, a living tattoo of the entity's presence. It was inside me, yes, but it was also through me, projecting outwards, staining the world with its true form. The horror was no longer contained within the confines of my mind, nor the forgotten pages of a book. The subtle, inexplicable phenomena were not anomalies, they were the initial brushstrokes of a new dawn, a new language. My own form, I suspected, had become as porous as the air, a phantom limb of the land. I watched the horizon, or what I believed to be the horizon, through eyes that saw too much, or perhaps too little. The sky was a bruise, perpetually shifting between an impossible violet and a sickly ochre. The sand dunes no longer lay static, they breathed, their crests rising and falling with an unseen tide, revealing and then burying shapes that were not quite rock, not quite shadow. My thoughts, once a tightly woven cord, now frayed and unspooled into the vast, echoing space of the array dishes. Then, a disruption. A speck of movement against the rippling heat haze. My non-existent breath caught. It was not the supply truck, not the infrequent patrol. This was different. A tremor, not of the land, but of memory. The vehicle pulled up to the main research station, kicking up a plume of fine red dust that hung in the air like a bloody cloud. A lone figure emerged. A young academic, by the cut of their clothes, the determined set of their shoulders. I remembered that posture. I remembered that hunger. It was the same hunger that had drawn me into the recursive spirals of the script. The new arrival carried a worn satchel, a relic of a world that was already crumbling at the edges of my awareness. They moved with a brisk efficiency, making their way to the entrance of the main facility. The air inside, thick with the scent of forgotten paper and ozone, seemed to stir, welcoming the intrusion. They moved with a clear purpose, heading directly for my abandoned office, the one I had occupied for so many months, the one that had become the crucible of my undoing. Was this the echo? Was this the final, terrible repetition? They paused at the threshold, a moment of hesitation, perhaps sensing the residual psychic static that clung to the air like a fine, invisible dust. Then, they pushed open the door. But it was the array of monitors that drew their gaze, still powered, still humming with a faint, malevolent energy. On the main screen, frozen in time, was the script. The anomalous characters, the self-generating linguistic structure that had been my fascination, my obsession, my ultimate undoing. But it was not exactly as I had left it. The patterns, once merely complex, now pulsed with an almost imperceptible rhythm, a silent, visual song. The new researcher leaned closer, their eyes widening with an intellectual rapture I knew all too well. They reached out a hand, not quite touching the screen, but hovering inches away, as if drawn by an invisible current. I saw the spark in their eyes, the nascent flame of recognition, the thrill of stumbling upon something truly unprecedented. A self-modifying syntax. I watched, helpless, as they unwittingly stepped onto the path I had forged. The script, now displayed across multiple screens, seemed to glow with an inner light, its complexity spiraling outwards, drawing the new researcher deeper into its hypnotic embrace. It was merely beginning anew. My legacy, a poison chalice, was about to be drunk again. And the world, through their eyes, would soon begin to unravel. The vast, parabolic dishes of the radio observatory loomed against a sky bruised with the last vestiges of twilight, their metallic surfaces reflecting a sickly orange glow. Inside, the hushed hum of servers and cooling fans was a familiar counterpoint to the cosmic silence I had come to understand. I moved through the labyrinthine corridors, a ghost in my own former life, drawn by the faint, shimmering aura that now emanated from the central research bay. A new researcher sat at my old station, a figure of earnest dedication hunched over the very screens that had been my undoing. Their fingers, still unblemished by the subtle tremor that had claimed mine, danced across the keyboard, pulling up my final, desperate notes. I could feel the tension radiating from them, a tightly wound coil of intellectual curiosity and growing frustration. Their brow furrowed, a precise line of concern deepening between their eyes as they scrolled through pages dense with symbols that had once been coherent, then distorted, and now they were something else entirely. I watched as their lips moved, silently mouthing the characters. My breath hitched, a phantom gasp in my throat, remembering the sheer effort it had taken to even perceive those final forms, let alone transcribe them. They weren't meant for human eyes, not truly. They were the language of a space between spaces, a grammar that defied temporal linearity, a syntax woven from the fabric of unbeing. The new researcher paused, their hand hovering over the mouse, then returned to a passage I had titled, in my waning sanity, The Untranslatable Silence. "What is this?" they murmured, their voice a low, bewildered whisper that sliced through the sterile air. "It's garbled. A cipher, perhaps? But the patterns are inconsistent. Random. Yes, to a mind constrained by the pathetic linearity of human thought, it would appear so. But I knew better. I knew the terrible, beautiful order hidden within that perceived chaos. It was the structure of everything not us, a blueprint for the dissolution of the familiar. The new researcher leaned closer, their eyes scanning the glyphs, then cross-referencing them with earlier, more sensible translations I had made. The contrast must have been stark, jarring. The initial elegance, the almost hypnotic rhythm of the early script, giving way to these jagged, impossible forms. They clicked on a recording of my voice, a fragment I barely remembered leaving, a frantic monologue meant to warn, but now sounding like the ravings of a broken thing. My voice, distorted and strained, spoke of the fracturing of meaning, of perceptions bleeding into one another, of the world unmaking itself from the inside out. A shiver ran through the new researcher's frame, a reaction I recognized intimately. It was the first tremor, the faint ripple on the surface of their calm intellect. They shook their head, a dismissive gesture, but their gaze lingered on the screens. They were looking for a key, a Rosetta Stone, a way to force the alien into the familiar. They would not find it. The language was the key, and it opened doors to places best left sealed. I saw the subtle shift in their posture, the way their shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a strange, almost receptive resignation. The light from the screens, once merely illumination, now seemed to pulse, to breathe with a soft, insidious rhythm. The new researcher reached out, not to the keyboard, but to the screen itself, their fingertips brushing against the glowing characters. For a moment, their reflection wavered, stretching and distorting as if cast upon an uneven surface. Their eyes, once clear and inquisitive, now held a nascent flicker of something else, a deep, unsettling stillness, a comprehension that was not their own. They were not translating my notes, not truly. They were receiving them. The air in the room grew heavy, tasting of profound age and the dust of forgotten dimensions. The hum of the servers seemed to deepen, to resonate with an undertone that was not mechanical, but biological, like a vast, unseen creature breathing. The new researcher closed their eyes, a slow, deliberate act, and when they opened them again, the world was already beginning to look different to them. They were seeing the cracks. The language had found a new host. My work was done. The seed was planted, the cycle renewed. The cosmic threat persisted, untamed and perhaps unstoppable, continuing its silent work, rewriting existence one perception at a time. And I, Reid Chen, was merely an echo in the growing chorus of its terrible, beautiful song.